This is Dr. Chris Lemmon, and talking to you from my living room. I'm a bit of a philosopher, I guess, or maybe just another lost soul. But anyway, I've been doing this for a long time, and I just keep coming up with ideas. And I've got a new piece. I'm actually two pieces that I'm working on. My goal has always been to help direct people somewhat through this maze of development and change that we're always in the midst of in growth in life, as all of you are aware of if you're listening to this. So let me give you a little bit of a background before I go into what I'm projecting or what I'm introducing as an idea. And so the background is that I think somewhere in my youth, I was aware that I could sense or feel some type of pattern or something going on. It felt like walking through a labyrinth. It felt like there was a movement that right was a better choice than left, that this way, that way, all made some kind of difference. I don't know where that came from. It's an anomaly, maybe just a mutation. I'm not all that sure, maybe a methylation problem. Anyway, I was stuck with that, and in my mind, we're always looking at the self. We're a little bit selfish as humans, and we're saying, "Wow, this is maybe my gift of life." You know, blah blah blah. The story that runs through a 14-year-old's head, and sometimes through a 54-year-old's head, is not much different. When you start to look at those and you balance those two out, and you say, "Well, this is very interesting. I wonder where this goes." I played it through with poetry. Can you imagine? I wrote poems and went to coffee shops and read poems. I thought maybe those patterns were inherent in poetry or prose of some sort. I wrote some articles, none of which were very good or got published. The skill actually never fulfilled itself, at least not in the short term. I did music. I played lead guitar in a band for a while. Not really very good. What I learned is that my application of, or at least my awareness of these patterns or things that I felt was really not so much artful. It was a little bit more structured and more technical. It's more like, once again, lost in a maze. I did some hiking. I volunteered as a Boy Scout leader. I thought that maybe a sense of directions. I even got into search and rescue. I thought all that was relevant to that. I found an awful lot of people that can get unlost in the woods much quicker than I am. And it didn't play out in none of those genres. Because it felt a little more structured, I thought maybe I should go into engineering. And so that's what I did. At the time I went into electronic engineering. I probably would have went into computer engineering, but in those days, engineers work with slide rules on the computers. So pretty much my choice was the abstract piece was electronic engineering, and I was into that for a few years. And somewhere in the mix of all this, in my early college days, I think that I was maybe 20 or 21, probably 20, a group of us, one night going to movies, going out to eat or something, we stopped by a neon psychic in Roseville, California, and a very sweet lady from somewhere in Europe, Bulgaria or some Bolivia, I don't know, somewhere Bulgaria, I think, in Europe. I'm not sure. We just went in there and paid a couple bucks, and everybody got a reading, and then we went down to a coffee shop, and everybody was talking about their readings. But what I'd noticed for myself in that experience is that everyone in a group with me all got a typical neon store reading from a psychic. This is meant for your life, and blah, 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 blah. As the story goes on and on. It's just a story, right? But when I sat in front of her, she looked at me and she started asking me questions. And she would ask me, "You see these patterns? Do you see that movement? What does this mean? What I notice is numbers in you. What do you do with numbers?" She asked me questions. She never gave me a story. She never gave me anything. She just asked me questions. And towards the end, she said, "If you would like to pursue your awareness of all this stuff, but come back and see me, and I'd be glad to help you." and it was kind of the end of it. I never went back to see her. But it opened up an all new doorway, what I'd call a mystical doorway. Not that I'm looking for any more woo-woo. We've got enough of that in the world. But most certainly I started to see something that was maybe not so structured as engineering. I then started looking at, I did an intern program in engineering, and I started realizing that my idea of being able to fulfill these patterns was more in innovation and really less in the day-to-day mundane piece of being able to produce an engineering project. So I immediately dropped out of engineering somewhere in my junior year and switched over to psychology. In psychology, I could start to find some language and terminology about patterns that operate within the human context. I could then look at people, and some of that made sense to me. It's almost as if I found a little home for that skill set that I still wasn't too sure what it was all about. Somewhere around age 25, I started teaching things. That was never intentional, but I would teach first aid. They were looking for a volunteer. I would teach this over here. I'd teach this from rescue. I was, like I said earlier, I was in Boy Scouts. I taught different classes. I wound up teaching, not as a living, but just as a hobby on the side. I was constantly teaching things. I would find things, teach them. Sitting in front of people teaching a class allowed me all of a sudden to start to realize that, wow, those patterns are almost the way information flows. I started seeing, it's like, wow, it's interesting. This is a matrix of how they work. Wow. And they're all different. So immediately I realized I need more experience with this because there was too many variables. I had discovered something, I thought, and I had no idea what it was. And so I did a few intuitive readings. I did counselings. I was already in training in psychology, so I didn't have a clinical license. I didn't know what to do with that education. So I did counseling with people. I talked with people that had problems. I talked with people that showed up on my doorstep. There was quite a few, maybe 8, 10 a week that I'd be talking to. So I finally went down and joined a Berkeley Psychic Institute and went through all their senior program. By this time I was 39 years old, I think. And spent a couple of years because what I recognized is I needed more practice. I needed to sit in front of more people. I needed to look at more diversity and patterns. So it was fun being able to look at all that, to see all that diversity, to go and do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of moments spent with people. That connection of oh, I understand what you're saying, but how you get there is different than how I get there. That's what I was trying to get a handle on, right? So pretty soon I departed from them. They had a lot of structure. They had a lot of ideas. They were whatever they were. It was all fine and good. It was an interesting adventure for a while. When I got out of that, I started teaching because I started thinking maybe I should go into teaching. By this time, I was 40-some years old, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I really want a career change. And I was also by that time into sales and training people. And I started looking around and thinking, all I'm doing right now is teaching anyway. I'm just getting paid to run a district and hire and train salesmen and develop routes. So I'm actually doing that. I'm actually utilizing all these tools, all this supposedly skill sets that kind of fit into my matrix of how I operated. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So I played with that, and that became my career in life, so to speak. I still dabbled in teaching on the side. It was kind of a refresher. When I'm teaching classes, people that were open to new ideas would sit before you. It gave me a bigger range than someone who just simply wanted to purchase something, or someone that was managing a chain of convenience stores and we were just doing some marketing programs. So there was a lot more diversity. There was a lot more interest in it. And I just decided that as soon as I was done working for a while, and I would go ahead and start teaching full-time, which I did. I opened a center and I started teaching full-time. Still not quite understanding what all this mystical piece was. and not thinking of it as being anything magical or special. But most certainly, by the time I was probably, by the time I was 65 years old, I really came to the conclusion that everybody had that same ability. I could most certainly bring it forth in most everyone to some relative degree. But I didn't think of it as being special to me. I think maybe it was just an anomaly that got my attention for whatever reason, and I played with it. I was really curious because of the nature of balance and the nature of imbalance. And after doing thousands of counseling sessions with people, I wound up having far more questions. And as I started looking more and more patterns and hearing more and more stories and noticing that the stories and the patterns were not congruent, the patterns seemed to run truer than the stories did. Tons of commitments, tons of assumptions, tons of crazy ideas that people had. It really was going nowhere. And it wasn't a particularly literary giant. And I'm not all that sure that I wanted to really write another book. I really wanted just to kind of understand it better for myself. I think that just getting a handle on life and being able to have a more comfortable relationship with being a human is very profound. And so that became the nature of my teaching. My teaching was about being able to secure the idea of no in life, to have a personal discipline of some sort, no matter what. I found early in life that patterns ran truer and more predictable with people who had some type of personal discipline. They were enriched in their life by the patterns that run in through them, rather than the crazy people that I've sat in front of many, many times. And they were just confused and going a multitude of directions and had really very little personal commitments. So starting to look at that discipline, or being able to secure the idea no, was my first step. The next step was I started realizing very quickly that people repeat themselves. Life is habitual, right? And if we don't stop that habit of repeating something, we need to be done with that habit. So securing done was the next step. Securing we, that is, securing the idea of a plural I. I can start to think that maybe I'm special, but when I started looking around and seeing that everybody else was also special too, all of a sudden I was part of a group. We were all uniquely different, but all uniquely special. If I looked at a group of people that all thought like I did, I had a group of people for a period of time, and then they all went away. So I used to, when I was training teachers, I would say, teach to the material that you're looking at. Don't teach to the students that are in front of you. You keep the students for a while, and you think you're doing good because you're providing what they want. But in truth, you're just simply buying a little bit of time of sameness. Pretty soon they don't hear the difference. They only hear the sameness, and then they go by their wayside because they're not learning anymore. So you always have to look at the material and let it unfold and see where it's going and pursue it. And so that's what I've been doing for many, many years. In, I think, 2013, I read a book that was a nice little review in my head. It was, and a lot of you have read it because it was a very popular book. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman wrote this book, a psychologist, and as a result of some of the ideas that he purports in the book and the project that he worked with other people, he wound up getting a Nobel Prize in economics from playing with the concept of utility. The tying together of three things that I was at that time in 2013 looking at was, number one, absolutely strong. We have two systems of processing the experience of life. We have a very automated system that sits in there, which Daniel called thinking fast. It's always on, it's always running, it's really, really quick. It's very, very quick because it doesn't pick everything out of a database. It just simply picks the most likely and runs it as if it's true. It makes a lot of big assumptions, but it's very fast. If as long as you're in a world of similar, you live in a community where it's the same neighborhood, you grew up there, you've been there all your life, you know the culture, you know the people, you're in a job for 20, 30 years, you know your job well. Your intuition works amazingly well. Inductive reasoning is what we call it in psychology. It flows, it gives you information. It most certainly, you might go see a counselor because you have relationship problems or something that you don't have all that experience with. But as far as the genre of what's very familiar to you, it's very consistent. It works really good, and it doesn't turn off. And it has a loud voice. It even argues with your logic. But when you're going to do something new, all of you know this, you're going to do something new, you go read a book, you look at a YouTube video, you get some advice, you're venturing into something, your intuitive piece, this is the downside of it, your intuitive piece will automatically think whatever you're doing is like something familiar. And then it'll take it over here of where I don't know and put it into where I do know and run it as if it was the same thing. And it's not. It's a huge amount of errors in life come when you start to entertain a bigger change, when you move out of community, when you get divorced, when there's big change that occurs in your life. Somewhere by the time I was 30 years old, what I started seeing after sitting in front of students those years is that I would do like the Mayans did, right? Do you remember the story of the Mayans? They projected future out in their charting, right? Because their charting wasn't just the stars. It was tying astrology and astronomy together into a package to making personality profiles. And they ran all these things forward in time. And we're looking at all these streams that I talk about. I was able to see. They worked with all these streams that were really very good at it. And all of a sudden they saw it ran all amok and everything fell apart. And they thought maybe the end of the world or something. Well, I mean, we're long past the end of that piece. But nonetheless, what they saw was a huge meme change, a change in the culture that's coming along that affects the planet. These things occur all the time, but they occur in small pieces. They occur over here, over there, different cultures. The more that we start to unify on the planet, the more that we connect, the more that we start to realize that we're connected, the more that we travel, the more that we watch world information on the news rather than just our local genre or reading a local paper. And the more diversity we start to bring into the play of things, the more that we start to recognize that, wow, different people in the world think a little differently than we do. They do things a little differently than we do. It's very interesting to start to see. Their patterns seem to be somewhat the same, almost predictable in familiar, what's familiar for a human. Familiar, where do you want to do, what do you want to do with your kids? But some of those base patterns are all of a sudden starting to change. I saw that coming out into a future just by running a timeline and imagining what would happen to this pattern, how would this mature? I was interested, as a teacher, I was interested in how would this mature? So I would project it forward and I'd see this crash. I'm not too sure what the Mayans did. I'm not even saying it's anything associated with Mayans. But most certainly they were running whatever their knowledge was and saw this confusion, and I saw this confusion. So I started then, by the time I was then 35 years old, I started then looking at how can I impart some of this wisdom? How could I include this into something? And so then became part of the platform that I started to integrate into my teaching was the fact that things are going to kind of fall apart at the seams out here. So don't sit there and get comfortable and think you've got it all figured out, because we really don't ever have it all figured out in a changing world. My voice is a little hoarse. I've been doing a little bit of repair work for a neighbor down the street. They had a roof leak and some sheetrock work. And anyway, so I've been battling dust. So my throat's a little dry. So for the most part, I'm thinking, wow, okay. In 2013, I read this book. It was a nice synopsis of exactly what I noticed. Two systems at play. One is this intuitive and inductive reasoning system that simply plays on the automatic. And the other one is a nice logical system that we have. We're really very intelligent, right? we can figure things out. You give us enough data, we can start to put it together. If we can keep that into a package, to a parcel, in other words, if we can keep our attention on it and don't get distracted by intuition that wants to move it all over to another stream, it needs to be its own pathway. And we can keep that in its own pathway, we can learn something from it. As long as we're attending to it, we have this amazing learning power curve that allows us to just gobble this all up and build a database. If we're not really careful, at some point in time, that database will start to merge with others and it all start to get murky. But as long as we're very disciplined in all that, we can keep all those separate. Matter of fact, did such a great job of keeping them all separate that's why this guy won a Nobel Prize in economics, because of the term utility. He started realizing that utility was assumed that the greatest prize, the greatest reward, was the utility for humans. In other words, we're driven to get something out of something. And that was the definition for utility in economics. As a psychologist, when he put together a program, he started realizing that avoidance of loss was also great and sometimes greater. So he wound up coming up with a new idea, a new theory. He was part of a group that put together a new theory, and for that changed the very nature of the term utility in economy. So economics, so we start to realize that sometimes we go for a greatest reward, sometimes we just simply go for avoidance. We will say no to a job that pays more, but maybe it's a longer drive, it's more hours, there's weekend demands, and we just start to think it's not worth it. We have all had experiences with that where it's really not worth it. Or we've had friends that are just simply drama queens or drama prince. Anyway, most certainly they have a lot of drama in their life. And pretty soon we decide that, we're really just not going to hang out with them anymore because there's always some crisis that's going on. We've all had those experiences, right? So this is what we start to look at. All of this is like, why is this so complex? Why is there so many pieces? There's two systems struggling against each other. Within you, there's two systems struggling with each other. And this one is, the automatic one is dominant for really good reasons. Number one, it's fast. It's probably going to keep you alive. It really has a lot of wisdom based on your experience. It has no wisdom based on your lack of experience. But you will act as if you have wisdom when you really have when you're totally lacking experience, and it won't work for you then. There's a fallacy in the design, but the design is amazing. I'm not too sure that we could put it together and have it be certain and overly confident and demanding and have drive if it was doubting itself. So I think that the way it was put together was really probably pretty wise. We just have to learn to deal with it. So this is the nature of a lot of my teaching, and a nature I'd like to bring into the forefront, at least where I'd like to go forward into the future, whatever my future is here at 75. But most certainly I'd like to keep bouncing ideas forward. And playing with this webinar is most certainly relatively inexpensive to be able to have you communicate back. We haven't found a forum to have talks yet, but when I do a topic, I usually invite half a dozen people here in my living room, and we sit down and we debate ideas and talk through ideas and discuss things. And I've been working with 2 different programs for this last year and a half, trying to put it into some type of format so we can start to teach it. So the nature of what I'd like to do with this is I found in a book, lots of books, right? The Moral Tribes by Joshua Green. Neither one of these are a real simple read, but Joshua Green brings some research from a lot of different books, Stumbling on Happiness, a lot of different books that I've read, probably at least at least 20 in the last, well, since 2013. I probably read 7-8 books a year. So in the field, mostly in the field of science or economics. I've read quite a few in economics later, so I get more of a handle on utility. I think there's a keynote in here of being able to understand value. And I go back to spiral dynamics and those concepts that came out of spiral dynamics, was originally considered a value program. In other words, it was considered, the original program was, how do we arrive at value? So it was really a program about utility. How do we arrive at value? And that was what the design of the program was. I saw the original program. It has been changed. It's been shuffled. Some of the stuff that's happened to it, I think, was probably good. It's struggled to become more of an ideology, I think, rather than just simply a useful tool. I don't know how much of that is the passion of the people involved or just marketing, but nonetheless, it's all in a state of change in a time where everything's pretty much in a state of change. I'm really looking at how do we just throw ourselves into this turbulence and chaos? We've always done that in the past, but most of these changes have been marked by introduction to the modern meme and coming into its when it finally reached a majority point, a voice majority, at least in America. It was in the 50s and probably throughout Europe. And prior to that, we'd gone through 2 world wars. I think that when we start to look at the chaos that's created in the world and the violence and the turbulence and the disjointedness, I'd like to see us be able to go through these changes. So I think they're essential that we take a step up, but I'd like to do it in a little more peaceful and civil way so that we can learn from it rather than react to it. Most of us react to change. I most certainly react to change. So it's like, I think most people out there have some reaction to change. Because life is so habitual, it does require changing habits. So having said all that, I think that if we start to keep our focus on the utility of something, the value of something, and we can get out of our story index, we can then have enough attention. If we can put it into a format where it allows us to have small pieces that we can attend to, keep them in a separate stream, allow that, there's nothing wrong with that intuition, allow it to run in the familiar, allow it to keep you alive, allow it to support you, but don't allow it to misguide you. If you're mad at the world, the answer isn't to go get a gun and shoot people. The answer is to sit down and figure out where you're missing the mark. Where is it guiding you that it's wrong? It's misguiding you. Our own internal systems are misguiding us because of the level of change that we sit in the midst of. It doesn't make sense in yesterday's newspaper. It's different today. So it's very confusing. It's frustrating. Most people just get sick, right? And you can see that, right? Look at the numbers. Most people get, there is most certainly a tie between emotional sickness and mental sickness. As far as I am concerned, from what I see in life, is that at least all the people that had really are in a big emotional trauma, they also wind up getting sick. And so there's certainly a tie between those two systems. They play heavily on one another. You can perhaps keep someone alive in a coma and most certainly not know exactly where their mental state is because you can't communicate with them. But I'm not all that sure that in those cases we have someone in a really good mental state. Anyway, the nature where it sits, I think that if we can start to focus on the utility, what is the value? And keep in consideration that there's also a factor of loss in there. In other words, move in the direction of value, not pursuing something like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's always a fairy tale. But start to recognize that moving forward, there's a factor of loss that comes into play too. We have to balance the gain and the loss all the way through, which gives us a sense, a more mature sense as Daniel brought through in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, a far more mature sense of being able to arrive at the utility or the value that we're trying to get out of something as we move forward to being able to balance those two out. So being able to structure some type of a protocol together so that we can sit down and start to look at that and say, okay, I'm making changes here. This is all we're going to call growth. We're going to call it whatever silly name you want to put onto it. I don't care what your story index tells you. We're changing. I'm moving in a direction of change because everything on the planet changes. That which doesn't change, you'll find represented highly in a cemetery. Tombstones are made of really hard material for a reason. They're not expected to change, right? I want a tombstone made out of jello, so it'll change. Silly saying, but nice idea. You start to see that everything's in a state of change, so we really have to embrace this change, and we have a system that assumes that everything stays the same and never changes, and that everything compounds and makes us wiser. In a world that changes, it just does not work. It's not realistic. We now have to reframe it into a more realistic format so that we can look at it in a far greater way. I've researched forever from the wisdom of the ages and metaphysical concepts and everything else. I've used a lot of that to frame all of these things out and talk about them. I don't see anything wrong with those story indexes because a story is just a story. The whole conscious human thing is just a story, right? So the more variables we have into the story indexes, the more patterns that are useful in life come into that. It can be very beneficial, but it also can blindside you tremendously, right? Look at the issues we have in the world today with religious battles. And I just went on vacation this last year for 2 Muslim countries, really sweet people. I saw no problem there. The big problem that I see is that there's a united force between government and church. So that means that when we have a church or a religious issue, we're really having a government issue. Politics has an interesting wide span of swing that you've all noticed down through the ages. And churches were intended to be a little more stable, right? And so when you tie something that wants to swing to something that wants to stable, all you've got is really a group of people taking a very honorary viewpoint and not being flexible on it. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the world. We need to get out of that bias. So we start to implement a program with utility. We start to take a look at this intuitive piece, this direct piece. We start to look at the other system. How do we integrate the other system? There's some anomalies between the two systems. Thank goodness that all these people have done all this work, research work, neuroscience, all that, to be able to start to see how the system works. As we start to understand now, and as we move into 2020, we'll start to understand it's like, wow, I got more of an understanding of how the automatic system works. I then can override some of that in a far better way. Not such an arm wrestling with myself, turbulent piece that drives your head crazy for years trying to figure things out. When there is no figure it out, there's no story index that works for it. The mystical aspect doesn't have a story index that works for it. I just feel things. That's it, right? So then how do I apply that? Just like I can run my hand over a wall and get a sense or a feeling of whether it's smooth or not. I said this week I was doing some sheetrock work. So being able to get a sense or a feel is really an important part of that task. It's very useful when we apply it to sheetrocking, but I cannot run my hand over top of one of your stories out there and feel the smoothness in it. They're all jumbled up with bits and pieces of data, some from now, some from future vision, some from past experience, all packaged into a conscious little story. It's a mess to sort through. The driving force for anything in motion is balance. We humans are creatures that are in motion, so we need to have some semblance of balance. And so we never go too far left or right, or we fall off the fence. Humpty Dumpty was not a good story. We really have to stay in a balance point. That's our struggle. We need to move forward slowly, find those balance pieces, being able to bring this into some type of a stream. We've been working with some of my cohorts, and I have been working with a couple of different programs. One was to start to look at how many assumptions that we made, how many streams of commitments we made. All of them are unconscious to each other, and start to look at what influences all those threads or streams that are running that I can sense and feel, and a lot of other people can too. But we can talk about them, but I'm not trying to talk about them. I'm talking about how can we cognitively give you a new story that will help you to be able to change those streams, right? I think cognitive behavior therapy was a really good step in the direction, but now there's been dozens of different ideas and shuffling to it. And we're into positive psychology, moral psychology, for heaven's sakes. And we're looking at all these pieces because each one, when we examine it, becomes unique in itself. But don't forget that these all run together. It's all a package of you. And all this is going on at once, and only a really small part is conscious. There's some great tools. There are some great techniques that are developing right now as we speak. And I think it's great to be able to look at those and get on the cutting edge. So I'm looking at introducing that probably next year. We have, as I was saying, 2 footprints adrift. One is to be able to discover what's pulling you in different directions and what assumptions are in there and how do you balance that. That in itself has very little reward because we simply turn it back off once we find it. We discover the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and then we forgot where we put the gold. That's pretty much the human drama. But utilizing that tool with another piece, and that is that how do these structure themselves? How do those threads, remember I said I've been looking at these all my life, how these threads unfold, how do they structure themselves? How are they uniquely different so that we can tell? Because right now it's unconscious. How can we tell which stream we're in? How can we tell where our work is at? How can we tell our progress? How can we find the utility? Remember, utility means not just a gain, but it's also avoidance of loss. So how do we keep that in a state of balance as we move forward? How do we walk the wall and not fall off the wall? And so the design that I'm playing with and I'm introducing right now, and we'll be doing a test on it between now, which is August, and the end of the year with a group of people to be able to see how we can put this into a practical application so we can present some of those ideas to you. And so that becomes the goal. And so stay tuned. We'll have some series of webinars coming out pretty soon that are going to address those. They may wind up being several parts to the package. It's as we move forward into the new cultural mandate, most certainly we're dealing with more and more complexity. So we'll see how that materializes. So anyway, so Dr. Chris Lemmon, looking forward to working with you next year with some new ideas and some new fun programs to play with and see if we can't squeeze a little utility out of playing with some of these ideas. All right, thanks.